What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch here, live for my reaction to the Julio Jones trade. Julio Jones to the Tennessee Titans, of all teams, of all places. We knew it was between the Patriots and the Titans. Ultimately, there were some rumors about Julio potentially going to the Chargers or going to the Seahawks or going to the Rams or going to this place and that place and this place and that place. But it was down to, I believe, really just the details. From what it sounds like, the Titans at the end of the day did not have a lot of competition for Julio Jones. I think that's pretty interesting because, for one, Julio Jones had to pick the team he wanted to go to. So he had the right to choose because Atlanta was going to give him the right to choose, not because it said in his contract, okay, that he could choose, but because Julio is Julio. And a lot like Matthew Stafford, you know, it's doing good by that veteran player that's done really well for your franchise and was one of the greatest players in your franchise history. And that is Julio Jones. You could argue Julio Jones, you know, before we even get into the trade and before we even get into the impact on the Titans and things of that nature, I think you could argue that Julio Jones is the greatest Atlanta Falcon of all time, at least in terms of, you know, accomplishment. I think when you look at like who's the best player to ever play in Atlanta, that's probably Deion Sanders, I would think. You know, there might be a couple others if you argue Tony Gonzalez, but that technically doesn't count. Okay, but Julio Jones has had a historic career, right? He's going to go down as one of the greatest receivers of all time. Where you put him on that list is up to you, but I would consider him in that top 10 conversation right now, and I think he'll end up retiring closer to the top 5 conversation. We'll see what the Titans can get out of him at the end of his career. But yeah, so to Atlanta fans, I want to cover you guys right now, okay? So the Atlanta Falcons, Julio Jones, thank you for your service, all right? Thank you for being a great Atlanta Falcon. Thank you for taking us to places where we didn't know we could go. We were this close to beating Tom Brady in the Super Bowl. I'm using my Atlanta Falcon fandom here and bringing it to you guys, even though I'm not an Atlanta Falcon fan. But hey, congratulations on an awesome career in Atlanta, and now you're moving on to the next chapter in Tennessee, and I'm excited to see what happens. So, you guys, Atlanta fans, you get a second-round pick, and you get a fourth-round pick next year. Then you're swapping a sixth-round pick, and of course, Julio Jones to the Titans. So, Julio Jones and a sixth for a second and a future fourth. That's the trade. That's how it went down. That is the formula to get this thing done. And that's where I want to start, okay? So I really think that Julio Jones to the Titans was the only landing spot for Julio Jones at the end of the day. You know, I think maybe New England was in there, but just judging off of the package and judging off of the details of the move, this is the key part of the move that I don't know who's talking about it, but the real key part to the move is the money that Tennessee is taking on for this trade to go down, right? I think that was the key because the Titans are taking on $15 million this year. They're taking on basically the full load of the contract for Julio Jones. So that is why Atlanta did not get a first-round pick for Julio Jones. You know, this is the thing that I don't like from certain people. They're like, oh, you get a second-round pick, you trade second-round pick for Julio Jones. Yes, that's good for some teams. That's not good for other teams. Okay, this is a guy who's a fantastic receiver, and we're going to get into the reasons why. But I mean, he's getting a little bit older. He's in his mid-30s, guys. You're not going to get a first-round pick, and you're going to take on $15 million for a receiver that is at the end of his career. Like, Julio Jones, we're going to get into why he's going to help the Titans, but you could potentially only have one great season left with Julio, right? You could. Like, we've seen receivers fall off quickly, especially the types that Julio Jones is, right? Like the Calvin Johnson type of players, where they're massive targets, where they also combine rare speed and rare size. And like, those guys don't come around very often, so usually they don't last very long. Julio is already outlasted, potentially. His prime has outlasted what a lot of people thought it would last. Like, for Julio to be this good at this point in his career is pretty awesome and pretty magnificent, to be honest with you. Like, it's pretty special that this guy is still playing at this level. So that's the question for you Titans fans. What level is this level, right? So I think Julio Jones is not the best receiver in football anymore, where like maybe you would have put him there a couple years ago, or even last year, which I believe I put him first last year at the end of the year going into this year. But I think we've seen where Julio has been surpassed. And I think a lot of it is availability. Like, Julio Jones, the problem is, again, the speed, the size. It means you're going to get dinged up. And when you get dinged up, you're going to miss time. And your availability is going to hurt you as a player, right? On the field, productivity, it's going to hurt your team. So the biggest downside to Julio Jones at this point in his career is the availability of Julio Jones. How often will he actually be 100%? Not just playing, but 100%. That is, at the end of the day, I think the real X factor to this trade, this move, is will Julio Jones be healthy enough in the key moments where the Titans need him to be to get the most out of this move? And if you're the Titans, you're looking at this move as it's not really a big deal, right? Like, it's going to help your team massively, but a second round pick, for as good as it could do Atlanta for rebuilding to get rid of the contract, it's also not a big move for the Titans to get rid of a second round pick, right? We've seen the Rams get rid of first round pick after first round pick for elite players. Now, these players have been younger, but elite players, and it's benefited them. It's helped them go for it, so to speak. And I appreciate that the Titans are going for it here. And that's what they're saying to us with this move for Julio Jones. They're saying second round pick, fourth round pick, doesn't matter what it takes. We're going to take all your money on. We think if we get Julio Jones, we can do some damage. Maybe we won't win, but at least will give us the chance, the opportunity to win, to do something, right? And that's what I always love from the processing, from the just overall thought of the NFL. I'm somebody that hates NFL teams who don't do anything, who just sit back, they lay back, they let everything come to them. You don't win in the NFL today by doing that, okay? The NFL has adapted a little bit of NBA, okay? You gotta go out and you gotta snatch what you want. You gotta take it. And that's what the Titans have done here by getting Julio Jones. The player Julio Jones, what is he? Like I said, not the best receiver in football, but I think you could consider him, when he's on the field and available, top 5 in the league. And something that I think benefits Julio Jones, which I spoke about on the Juke podcast, which if you guys aren't checking that out, go check that out with myself and Dr. Jen Welter, who is the first woman coach in the NFL. So first female coach in the NFL is pretty special. And we do a podcast every single Wednesday live on Twitch. And we've been discussing the Julio Jones move pretty in depth, like pretty consistently for the last couple of weeks. And when it came to the Titans, the biggest thing that stood out to me was that Julio Jones is not going to have to always be the number one guy. And that's something to me that I think Atlanta was also going for with Calvin Ridley. And I think it also saved Atlanta's offense, right, when Julio got hurt. Because we saw Calvin Ridley was able to step up and step in to the number one wide receiver role, right? And when Julio wasn't there, it didn't really absolutely destroy the offense. Like, did it hinder the offense? Yes, it hurt the offense to a degree, but the offense in Atlanta was still productive even without Julio because they had a Calvin Ridley. Now, with the Titans, if you have Julio and you have A.J. Brown, that's phenomenal. You're going to have big outings. You're going to put up points in certain matchups where you're just throwing 40 on the board. But then there's going to be other games where, hey, maybe Julio leaves with a hamstring, or maybe he's unavailable this week, and we need A.J. Brown to really be that number one alpha target, and he can do that because he's proven he can do that. Now, you don't have a Corey Davis to kind of be that really great number 3. You did bring in Reynolds to be a number 3, which I don't think is bad. I think he's okay, right? He fits a similar profile to these targets, although he's a little bit skinnier in frame. He's not as big and physical as Julio and A.J. Brown, but he's definitely, tall, pretty good player as a number 3 receiver. So maybe he could step up into the number 2 if Julio is not there. But you kind of got to think about all these things. And I think with the wide receiver position, with the cornerback position, these are positions where you're trying to stockpile talent. Like, it's like you're trying to move guys down the depth chart, so to speak, where like if a receiver is a number 1, if you have 2 number 1 receivers, you're most likely going to be productive in the passing game every single week. And it's going to make everyone else better is the point. So like if your tight end is just okay, he's going to be a lot better because he's facing less coverage. He's facing a lesser player. That third receiver is facing a lesser player, right? So when you have those type of players at the top of your depth chart, that's why I like depth at the wide receiver position, because the better your number 2 is, the easier it is for your number 3. The better your number 3 is, the easier it is for your number 4. We see this with the Bucks, where it's like stockpiling talent. You have Julio Jones, or you have you have Chris Godwin, and you have Mike Evans as the 2 number 1 wide receivers. And then everyone else is better because of it, right? So you have Scotty Miller, Antonio Brown, and then you add in Antonio Brown, where it's like, well, that's like a number 2 receiver nowadays in the NFL. So now for Reynolds and guys like this, Ferkser, guys like that, they're going to be better off. They're going to see lesser players because of Julio Jones being in the building. And it's a much better impact, bigger impact than a guy like Corey Davis. Because Corey Davis, for as good as he was last year, Corey Davis is very, very inconsistent. Like, I've seen games where he's been amazing. Like, I've seen games with Corey Davis where he was the best damn like wide receiver of that weekend. Like that Sunday, he was the best receiver I saw like all week. And for whatever reason, that seems to happen a lot versus the Patriots. But for whatever reason, Corey Davis has these weeks where he's amazing. He takes over. And then there's other games like in the playoffs we saw last year versus Baltimore, which I think was a real big reason that Tennessee did this move, that they did this trade. Because they saw what Corey Davis and a guy like Corey Davis brought them in the playoffs when the bright lights were there. When you needed to make the plays, Corey Davis wasn't there. He disappeared. Okay, so as good as Corey Davis was in some moments throughout his career for the Titans, especially the last 2 years specifically, and last year even more so, that's why he got the contract with the Jets, because people believe he can be a number 1. But my fear with Corey Davis has always been the consistency of Corey Davis is why, to me, I wouldn't want him as a number 1 and why he's a good number 2. But with Julio Jones, you don't got to worry about that because Julio is going to be great no matter what. And no matter who's covering him, no matter what the defense is, what the scheme is, what they try to do to stop him, you're going to have 2 guys that you must respect every single game. There's some games where just Corey Davis didn't have it. He just didn't have it sometimes. It's just like, what is this guy doing? Okay? And I'm not trying to speak poorly on Corey Davis, but you're comparing Corey Davis, who's a good number 2, to Julio effing Jones. Okay? So like it's a big difference there. Now you throw into the mix Jonnu Smith. Okay, this is the problem that I have with Titans fans or just people that are Titans apologists a little bit. So I'm trying to even it out. So it's awesome you got Julio. But remember, you did lose Corey Davis and Jonnu Smith. So you're not just losing Corey Davis, you're also losing Jonnu Smith. Now you could also say, okay, we added Reynolds, you lost Humphreys as well, who did nothing. But I'm just throwing that out there. So I think Jonnu Smith, here's the thing with Jonnu Smith. Jonnu Smith is going to be so much better for the Patriots than he was on the Titans. I guarantee you that. I guarantee you that right now as I sit here today. Because I think they're just going to use him better. Not that Jonnu Smith isn't a fantastic player, but again, the way the Titans used him last year and the year before, like you could see the talent popping off the screen, right? But like he was inconsistent because they didn't give him the ball enough. They didn't utilize him enough. They didn't put him in situations to succeed enough, right? So even though you lost an awesome talent at tight end, the impact on your actual team, we'll have to see because I don't really know. Like, I don't really know how big of an impact Jonnu Smith's going to be. Now, I will say, like, I'm always a guy that prefers, I'd rather have 3 really good receivers than 2 great receivers. I'd rather have 4 good receivers than 3 really good receivers. Like, that's just me. I just like depth. I just like playmakers because I know injuries come. I know when you're playing a good defense, they have 1, 2, 3 corners. So that's going to be really where the Titans have to get creative, right? Is like, I want to see how they utilize these two. I want to see how defenses react and defend them. Like, I want to see who's getting the respect week 1. Like, is it AJ Brown? Is it Julio Jones? Like, who's getting the doubles? Are you doubling both guys? Like, are you just saying, I'm doubling both these dudes, and then we're going to see if you can beat us elsewhere through the passing game? So the one factor I haven't brought up yet is, of course, Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry is going to benefit from this, obviously, because you can't play certain coverages versus Julio and AJ Brown when they're both healthy and on the field, right? That's the key. When they're both healthy and on the field. And when they're both at 100%, you can't play aggressive towards the run because Ryan Tannehill has proven that he can throw the ball deep and throw the ball deep effectively and efficiently, and he can beat you down the field. Like, Ryan Tannehill has earned the respect from the NFL now. Like, last year, people were still wondering whether he was a little bit of a fluke. People were still wondering if he was really the guy. But I think last year kind of proved to everybody that this guy is a legitimate quarterback, and not just a legitimate quarterback, but like an above average quarterback, like a good quarterback. There was something going on Twitter about Patrick Mahomes and like comparing him to Patrick. Nobody's comparing him to Patrick Mahomes. All we're saying, guys, is that Ryan Tannehill is underrated. And I believe Ryan Tannehill is underrated. And I believe personally that the biggest reason for success offensively for Tennessee has been Arthur Smith's play calling in combination with the resurgence of Ryan Tannehill. I think if you don't, as good as Derrick Henry has been and as good as the offensive line has been at times, you don't get to where you have been without a quarterback like Ryan Tannehill, who's making these big time throws, who's making these money throws off play action. There's a lot of quarterbacks who couldn't do what he's doing, right? So they elevated his play. And that leads me to the Arthur Smith conversation. Like, I wish Arthur Smith was still in Tennessee because I would know what I'm getting from this offense. I would be getting a top 5 offense in the NFL. But now that we don't necessarily know what it's going to be from this new offensive mind and this new scheme, I assume it'll be fairly similar, but Arthur Smith has been one of the most effective play callers down by down in the NFL, like in the top 3. I believe he was even the best last year, or at least in the top 3 again, in terms of his efficiency of play call, in terms of his utilization of play action, in terms of just when to call certain plays and just getting the best out of an offense. And that's been Arthur Smith, and that's why he was hired as a head coach for Atlanta, right? So I wish he was in Tennessee because I think we would see something special. Now that is really the question for the Titans. We know what we're getting in terms of their receivers, their two top end targets, A.J. Brown, Julio Jones. We know what we're getting. They're awesome players. We know what we're getting from Derrick Henry. We know now what we're getting from Ryan Tannehill. We know the offensive line is pretty okay. You know, it's probably a little bit above average, and they're very good run blocking wise. We know what we're getting. But from the offensive coordinator, what are we getting? That's the question. That's the question. All right, so let's take some questions, guys. If you haven't already, make sure you do Gronk spike that like button. And if you're just tuning in for the first time, make sure you do subscribe to the channel for more bottom line view reactions just like this. And guys, this is my raw reactions. This just happened earlier today. I've been processing all this. So it sounds like if it sounds like I'm all over the place, it's because I am. Because I'm trying to figure it out in my mind. You know, if I were to say, obviously the Titans won this trade. There's no question about it. But was it a bad trade for the Atlanta Falcons? Absolutely not, because they needed to get rid of Julio. Julio wanted out. He was gonzo. So they got some picks back. They got something back to help them in the future. We knew this is my problem. Atlanta. This is my problem with Atlanta, bro, if I got a rant right now. This is my problem. Atlanta, you know you're done. Your days are over. Over. Why are you trying to keep Matt Ryan around? Let my guy Matt Ryan free. Let him soar. Let him free like a bird. Let him go out the window. Let him go somewhere else. Imagine if Matt Ryan, now Titans fans won't like to hear this. Titans fans won't like to hear this. Imagine if it was Matt Ryan in Indianapolis and not Carson Wentz. Why, Atlanta, are you keeping Matt Ryan if you're getting rid of Julio? If you had the foresight to see that Julio would be gone, why didn't you say, wait, maybe we should trade Matt Ryan right now because we don't know how much we have left? Here's my problem, guys. Here's my problem. What if Matt Ryan comes out in 2021 this season and is absolutely a different player this year because he doesn't have Julio Jones? The statistics prove that Matt Ryan is not the same quarterback without Julio Jones. And although I think Matt Ryan is good, you are not going to get a better value for trading Matt Ryan than right now. So that's my problem with Atlanta, guys. It's not that they made this trade for Julio. It's that you got to commit. Are you going to commit to rebuilding? Commit. Because now we're in this situation where Matt Ryan is too good of a quarterback for this team to suck. So they're going to be some bummy 6-11 team. That's exactly what they're going to be. 100%. You can clip this right now. Atlanta is going to be 6-11 in 2021. They're going to be picking in no man's land in the draft. And they're going to be trying to get a future quarterback and moving on from Matt Ryan next year. Why didn't they do it now? I'm just saying. What's going on, NHL News Reports? Says, hey, Mitch, good to see ya. Found out about you from John. I appreciate it. Shark says, you're a Titans fan. I can respect that. I'm not a Titans fan, bro. I am not a Titans fan. But I am not on YouTube content creator as well, and ice cream. What? I don't know what you're talking about. Lobello says Titans have a better offense than the Chiefs now. No. Sorry. Sorry, sir. They do not. Where would I rank the Titans offense? I think that's a good question. They're probably going to be in the top 10. I don't know how far in the top 10. Because again, I question the play calling. I question the scheme. And this is why I say this is Mike Vrabel's season to prove it. Because he's lost his OC and he's lost his DC now. He lost Pease last year. He lost Arthur Smith this year. So, Mike Vrabel, I love you, buddy. I love you, bro. You're my man. You're my patriot. But, like, I really don't know. I haven't been able to tell how great of a coach Mike Vrabel is. You know, he seems to have a great way about him, personality to him. You know, players want to follow him into battle. But from a schematic perspective, I've always questioned him, and that was my question with him from the beginning. And he's been able to get masked by that, right? Because Pease and Smith have been there, right? So they've been there, and they've handled the scheme. They've handled the game plans. Vrabel's been the voice. This is now where Mike Vrabel needs to take a bigger step into that defense. And we'll see what he can do. Obviously, he's not an offensive guy, but I think we're going to learn a lot about it. Oh, yeah, yep. YouTube's all about the niches, bro. T-Bone says, coming into the season, I was very high on A.J. Brown in fantasy. I was also. How much should I be worried about the production now that Titans have Julio Jones? I would say, this is tough. I haven't really thought about it much, but I think A.J. Brown and Julio both have the potential to be number one fantasy receivers. I do. But I think if you were looking for A.J. Brown to be like a top 5 option in fantasy in PPR, maybe not. I mean, I'd probably both prefer them in best ball formats. That's where you can go to Underdog Fantasy, use the code BLV, cheap plug. But I'd like them in best ball, I'd like them in half point, and I'd like them in standard more so than PPR. Because they're probably not going to put up a ton of catches, but they're going to be very explosive players. So, obviously, you would like them more in formats where receptions aren't counted as much into the equation. But I think both of them will see a very big amount of targets as long as Julio is healthy. Again, this is the caveat to all of it, guys. I really question, the biggest thing I question with Julio is his health at this stage of his career. We've seen signs already. He's been able to play through it. Last year, he missed a lot of games. He was very good in those games. I'll show you the stats. He's very good, okay? He had 5.7 receptions per game. He had a 75% catch percentage, which is off the freaking wall, bro. Yards per game, 85.7, 3 touchdowns, 15.1 yards per reception. So he was awesome. Last year when he played. Now, not quite as good as he's been, right? Usually he's around, just for reference, he's usually around high 90 yards per game, 100-ish. He's been there before. Touchdowns obviously have never been his thing. But just in terms of yards, I think the injuries also played a role into when he actually played, he was also a little bit injured. So statistically speaking, he did dip last year slightly when he did play. I would expect, again, I said it already, I think he's a top 5 receiver. I think that's pretty safe to say. I don't think you could rank him any lower than number 5. And I think when he plays, he's going to be awesome. It's just managing that workload and I think not overdoing it with Julio until you really need him to step up. I would honestly be on the side of caution in terms of we know we're going to be pretty good. As long as we can get enough wins to get to the playoffs, then that's when I unleash Julio. I'm waiting till January. I'm waiting till December to unleash Julio to his maximum potential. Okay, if he gets hurt in January, then he gets hurt. But that's just the way I see it. And if A.J. Brown goes down, who's also had some injury history, like Monty says, then Julio can step up and be that number 1. The only problem with that is at his age, you don't necessarily want him taking on this load and all these targets especially with no Corey Davis or Jonnu Smith there, where it's like you don't really have a credible number 2 receiver. So that is an issue to a certain degree, but at least you have that guy in your building where like you can count on him to come through and be big. I think AJ Brown and Julio in fantasy will be, again, going back to that question, I think they could both be number 1 receivers. Like if I had to guess right now at the end of the year, assuming they both stay healthy, I'm going to assume that AJ Brown will be a number 1 receiver in fantasy. There's no question about it. Top 12 meaning, right? Top 12. And then for Julio, I think he'll at least be a number 2. And that's counting for injuries. So I think he'll be at least a number 2, which would be the top 24, right? And then he has the potential to be a number 1 fantasy receiver, right? Not real life, fantasy in terms of production. So I could see it that way. And then I think in terms of the rest of the offense, you're fading everyone except for Derrick Henry. Like obviously you're picking Derrick Henry, and I think it helps Derrick Henry. Now it might hurt him in terms of touches, and maybe in terms of touchdowns, but I think for the team itself, for fantasy, it will slightly hurt Derrick Henry, I think. Maybe. That's a tough question, because does it hurt a running back for the offense to get better? Or does it... That's actually interesting, because obviously the touches are going to go down, but the productivity is going to go up. Because Derrick Henry is going to see more opportunity on a higher scoring team where maybe they're in the lead and he's getting the ball more. Or maybe they take him out of the game at certain points. So, yeah, I haven't really thought about Derrick Henry so much. I still assume he's going to be, a first-round pick in fantasy and probably a top 5 pick in fantasy. So I wouldn't really stress it too much. But that's something to think about a little bit. In terms of the real team, though, it definitely helps Derrick Henry because it will take a little bit of the load off of his legs. And especially saving him for that time in the playoffs, for sure. Tannehill would be a good pick. Yep. Tannehill would be pretty good in fantasy. The question is, like, with Arthur Smith leaving, new coach, who's going to be, like, is Tannehill going to be the guy now? Are they going to pass the ball more? Like, that's my question, because Julio's entered the fray here. Is Tannehill going to be relied upon more to pass the ball? And I would expect, as I just said with Derrick Henry, I'd expect that to be the case. I'd expect Tannehill to throw the ball a little bit more this year, but I wouldn't expect it to be crazy. So I think he'll be really good. Tannehill, maybe even a sleeper in fantasy, but I don't think he'll be like a guy that wins you weeks necessarily. He'll probably just be a real rock solid starter in fantasy every week. Like a QB1, but not a guy that you're absolutely like when he's on the draft board, you're like, I got Ryan Tannehill. No, you'll be like, I got Ryan Tannehill. Nice, I can count on him. That's the reaction that I think I would give for him. Where would you rank Tennessee in the AFC? I did not do that yet. So, I'm going to say, let's think about it. So, I believe that the Chiefs are better for sure. I would still say that the Browns are better. And I would say, this is interesting because, like, I almost want to pull up the depth chart of the Titans and really look at them here. So, that's what I'm going to do. But I think they are, after those two, and maybe the Bills, I think you could argue they're better than everyone else. I mean, I think they're in the mix with those other teams. I think they're in the mix with the Ravens and the Patriots and the Chargers and, of course, the Colts. So, the way I look at this trade is, I think the Titans are the favorites in the AFC South now. That's the way I look at it. As for the rest of it, I have no idea. Like, I won't really know until they play. I think some people are overlooking some of the losses they've had, which is, of course, reactionary, for sure. And actually, this is a good time to bring up my boy Eric Eager from PFF, because Durkant was not happy about the tweet. So let's check this tweet out real quick. So basically what he said was his analysis of the Titans. New OC, lost all of their corners, lost some offensive line, Kirk-like quarterback, lack of depth after high-end weapons, defensive-minded head coach, highly paid running back, good draft. The Titans sound a lot like the 2020 Vikings to me. Okay, there's a couple things here with this. They're similar, okay? So they obviously run similar offenses. They have two awesome running backs. They have two quarterbacks that are like around the top 10, but probably just outside. I think Tannehill and Cousins are very, very close. Very, very close. Very similar. Yeah, and I think their offenses are pretty similar. Like, would you give the edge to the Titans receivers? Possibly, but it's really close, right? And yeah, like the Titans offensive line is better. I think that's the big difference on offense. The Titans offensive line is better. We don't know what the scheme is. Hopefully it could be as good as the Vikings. The defenses, I think there's a lot less holes on the Titans defense. I think what Eric is underselling in that tweet is the Titans defense a little bit. Now, I don't love the Titans defense by any means, but we have to understand, like, the Vikings last year were actually a playoff quality team. A playoff quality team at the end of the year. But the biggest reason they didn't make the playoffs is because they started off very poorly because their defense was absolutely awful. Their defense was atrocious. This year, like, the Titans, yes, they've lost some players. They lost all their corners, as he suggested, yes. But they also added players to their cornerback group. So, I mean, you can't really necessarily say that they didn't replace some of these guys, right? So they lost Malcolm Butler, who actually played well last year, because he didn't play well the year before. He played well last year, and that's going to be a short-term loss for them at cornerback. They lost Adoree Jackson, who's a good player, but he rarely played last year. Got to remember that. They brought in Janoris Jenkins. We'll see how he works in this system. He was really good for the Saints. We'll have to see how he looks on the Titans. I love Caleb Farley, guys. I love Caleb Farley, but I don't really know if he's going to be healthy day one, week one, right away for NFL action. So they might be missing him early. So certainly there's some concern at corner. So if you were to look at the Titans and say, like, there's some concern at corner just like there was for the Vikings, but it's not like there's all rookies. Like across the board, it's not like it's like all rookies like the Vikings had. And they were counting on second, third rounders, right? Safety-wise, they obviously lost your man Vaccaro, who I've always liked. He's still a free agent. Kevin Byard is obviously really good. I like their safeties, though. They have Amani Hooker, who I think's underrated. Elijah Molden, I like in the draft. And then they have Dane Kruchek, who's Kruchank. Sorry, I don't know how to say his name. Who's not a bad player. He's in a similar mold to Kenny Vaccaro. They brought in Bud Dupree, obviously, so that's a big difference from the Vikings last year. They didn't have Danielle Hunter, so people forget that, which is why I like the Vikings this year. But Bud Dupree, I don't think's Hunter by any means, but he's a solid player. And then they improved their front seven. You know, they brought in Danico Autry. They brought in a couple other guys. Obviously made some picks. Rashad Weaver in the draft. I don't know what's going on with him. Monty Rice in the draft. Still have Jayon Brown, which I thought was a good re-signing. So Avery Jones they brought in, not a bad signing. So they have I would say a better front seven and like less questions than the Vikings on defense. I don't think they'll be an absolute disaster the way the Vikings were. I don't think they'll be good necessarily, but I don't think they'll be a disaster. And they were already not very good last year, guys. Remember that. Okay, so this is going to be interesting. I think really what the Titans come down to, their ceiling comes down to their coaching. Like, it really does to me. It comes down to their coaching. How good's their offense? How good's their defensive scheme? That's going to determine how good they are. They have talent. Like, they have the pieces in place to be a pretty good team. I wouldn't say they're a favorite, but they're a pretty good team. And if those coaches can put these players in positions, favorable positions, then they can be a really damn good team. So that's the way I look at it. Again, to Ultra's question, where would I rank them in the AFC? They're the best team in the AFC South, in my opinion. But the Colts have better coaching. I think that's fair. They're right in line with the B teams in the AFC, to me. That's the Ravens. They're not an A team to me. They're a B team. Patriots, Chargers, and yeah, that's kind of where I would put them, is that B tier. And I think they might have some good matchups with certain teams there and bad matchups with certain teams in that range. Obviously, they lost to the Ravens in the playoffs last year. They lost their kicker. Gostkowski wasn't really that great, though. Yeah, I wouldn't really worry about that so much. He was kind of up and down. Joe Dog says, if their defense plays good, I can see them going to the Super Bowl. All right. I think that another question is, like, again, and this is why I'm a depth guy. Like, guys that follow me, I'm a depth guy. I like depth. I'll say it over and over again. I'm a depth guy. So it just scares me that in a couple of games this year, one of those receivers is going to be hurt and like it's going to hurt the team. But that's the risk you take. Like, that's the risk you take if you're trying to go for a Super Bowl. Like, if you're going to win the Super Bowl, guys, you got to be healthy at the end of the day. You're not going to win the Super Bowl if you're not healthy. So at certain moments, you just got to have some health luck. And like, if this team is fully healthy, they're going to be really good. They're going to be really good. And especially because if they keep that offense intact the same way they've been running it with Arthur Smith with maybe some new flavor, they run a lot of 2 receiver sets. They don't love 3 receiver sets. They like to have a fullback on the field. They like to go I formation. They like to be under center, right? So what they have is great for what they're doing. And hopefully Josh Reynolds, right? That was a signing you brought in. I brought him up a couple times. But that's a guy that, if need be, can step up in a big moment, I think. We'll see how that works out. Turtles tiers are Tier 1, Chiefs, Browns, Titans. Tier 2, Pats, Bills. Tier 3, Ravens, Chargers, Broncos. Interesting. I don't think it's debatable. I think the Colts have a very good coaching staff. I know the Lakers suck. Green Bay wouldn't have won a ring regardless, Camp, but I appreciate the thought. Monty says Calvin Ridley fantasy goes up. Oh, for sure. That's a good question, actually. Calvin Ridley becomes a top 5 receiver in fantasy. Like, go get him right now. Like, buy him right now. Go trade for him right now. Right now. I might actually have to do a best ball draft soon with these new moves here for Julio. Derrick Henry and Julio sound like a deadly duo, or it's more like a trio now, Jonathan. First round? No, probably late second round. Maybe. I don't exactly know, but probably second round. Okay. Anything else? Any other questions about this trade? I'm trying to think if I didn't cover anything. Ultimately, I love the trade for the Titans. It puts them in position to be a lot better than I thought they would be, right? Before this trade, just for reference, I thought the Titans would be like a 9-8 team, right? An 8-9, 9-8. I thought they might take a step back. In fact, I did. I thought they would take a step back this year without this trade. Now they've put themselves in position to not just not avoid that step back, but potentially take a step forward from where they were last year, which was just a wild card exit. And they were a home team in the playoffs. They won the AFC South. Okay. And then they lost the first game to the Ravens. So I think the logic would be that the Titans right now, their goal at the very least, right? Their goal is obviously to win the Super Bowl, but in the minds of people analyzing the NFL, the goal of the Titans should be to get to the Final Four of the AFC, which is the divisional round. That's one step above the wild card where they were eliminated last year. And I think that would be realistic expectations. So if you're a Titans fan, you should expect a playoff win this year. And you should expect to win the AFC South. If you don't win the AFC South, I'd be a bit disappointed. For sure. Because it's the weakest division in the AFC. And it's arguably the weakest division in the NFL. Okay? And the AFC is, I think, probably stronger top to bottom this year than the NFC. But that's actually debatable. I think it's pretty close. It's pretty close. Like, there's no, to me, like, the Bucks are pretty heavy favorites in the NFC, to me. The Chiefs are looked at that way in the AFC by some people, but not necessarily by me. They're the favorites, but not necessarily heavy favorites. Like, I could see a bunch of other teams possibly making it, and I think you would put the Titans in that category. So that's the way I would look at it. Hopefully I explained that well. When's the fantasy content coming? Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, maybe, so I'm going to be working on rankings for positions, right? So quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and so on. So maybe throughout that same time, I'll start working on fantasy stuff because rankings kind of go hand in hand with fantasy at the same time. Although like real life rankings and fantasy rankings are a little bit different. So maybe I'll start, but I'm not exactly sure because I do want to throw the odd video essay in there as well. So we'll see. But I do want to do a couple live drafts, maybe with a couple of you in there. We'll have to see what goes down. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the Julio Jones trade to the Tennessee Titans. It's been a while since I've been live. I appreciate you guys joining me. If you enjoyed, make sure you do Gronk spike that like button. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more Bottom Line View. Peace, guys.